Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. The American Society of Transplantation and the Indian Society of Organ Transplantation are proud to present today's joint session on deceased organ donation, comparing and contrasting practices across India and the U.S. In a moment, I will turn the session over to our panelists, ISOT President and today's moderator, Dr. Aneesh Srivastava, and ISOT Council Member, Dr. Manish Balwani. However, before we begin the main presentation, we do have a few housekeeping notes to help you engage with today's session. There is currently a viewership polling question displayed for the audience. Please take a moment to answer this question while we finish the remaining announcements. This webinar is being recorded and the archive will be available on the AST YouTube channel 2 to 3 business days after the live session. Please note that all of your lines have been muted so that only the presenters can be heard clearly for the archive recording. If you have a question for our panelists during the webinar, we encourage you to participate using the Q&A button in your Zoom webinar panel. Questions submitted via the chat window may be missed during the presentation. Finally, when you log off at the conclusion of today's webinar, you will see a link to a short evaluation survey to complete. Please fill out this survey to help us keep our content current and engaging. I will now turn the session over to our moderator, Dr. Srivastava, to begin our presentation.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. It gives me great pleasure to first thank the American Society of Transplantation to have collaborated with us for this webinar on the deceased organ donation practices. I know we in India are far behind. We need to learn a lot actually from US and from UK. Where I worked, I did my registrarship from the United Kingdom, renal transplant, long ago. Ever since, we have been trying to improve the practices in India. In southern part, of course, things are quite good, but we as a nation need to improve a lot. So this morning, we have two speakers. They are giants in their own field. And Dr. Matthew Cooper is the first one, and then followed by Dr. Akansha. So Dr. Matthew Cooper, if I tell him in brief about him, so he is the Chief of Transplantation Services, the Director of Solid Organ Transplant, and a Professor of Surgery at Medical College of Wisconsin. He is a great innovator, seeks new opportunities every day. His main clinical interests, they include kidney and pancreas transplant in pediatric as well as in the adult population. He's done work on the marginal donors as well, which are the need of the hour in view of the great difference or between the demand and supply of the organs. And he's involved in several ongoing research projects, primarily on immunosuppression, minimization, tolerance, avoidance of delayed graft function in the allografts following preservation injuries. Huge number of manuscripts written by him and abstracts with 12 book chapters. A regular visitor nationally as well as internationally, promoting the cause of education everywhere. Here I present you Dr. Cooper. Dr. Cooper, please.
Dr. Srivastava, thank you very much. My thanks to the organizers of this. This is a great honor for me. Also very proud to be a member of the American Society of Transplant's Board of Directors. Our collaboration with ISOT is very, very important to this organization as well as to the U.S. as a whole. This gives me a great opportunity to both meet my potential to try and leave transplant in a better place than I found it as I've now been 20 some years in the field, I really hope that there's additional opportunities for collaboration such as this. So I have the great pleasure of working with Dr. Agrawal here, who in and of itself was a pleasure meeting her, putting this talk together. We have somewhat of an interesting and large topic about deceased organ donation, but as we were talking, we thought it was important that we establish kind of a baseline of the system in the United States in terms of how policy and regulations and oversight and collaboration is necessary in order for transplantation to be successful in the U.S. I think it's interesting, despite a well-established program now in the United States, really, when donation and transplant began, it was in somewhat, territorial or somewhat only hospital-based. There was really no governance as mostly in the Southeast U.S. transplant surgeons and primarily those institutions where donor procurements occurred were kind of institutional only. And so eventually there became a recognition as an effort to try and expand donation. Organ procurement organizations became something in the 1960s and 70s, and we'll talk more about that. I think what really began to establish a system in the United States, and I am for the support of the government in helping transplant. We'll have some conversation around sort of where that appropriate level of support and oversight exists. But Congress developed the National Organ Transplant Act in 1984, which was out of a need to try and bring more opportunities for people that needed treatment for end organ failure. That formalized the OPO structure more so than certainly when things started, and then it's continued to evolve. But it also established what you hear is the OPTN, the Organ Procurement and Transplant Network. And why is that important? Well, it established that it was meant to be a partnership between government and a private nonprofit organization under a contract. And we'll talk a little bit more contracts moving forward. You probably have also heard of the organization UNOS, the United Network for Organ Sharing, which was the contractor which overheld the initial contract in 1986 and really has been the sole contractor until just recently when the boards have since separated. If you're ever, I'm biased about this, I know, as a past OPTN president, but if you're ever in the U.S. and anywhere near Richmond, Virginia, which is where the United Network for Organ Sharing calls home, please visit. It's a beautiful place, with lots of history and certainly lots to celebrate, but also the wonderful donor memorial there, I think is, something to witness. So again, if ever in the area, it's worth a trip. The next sort of phase of things is the OPTN final rule, which was to provide some structure, around NOTA. And it established a board of directors, that the need for an oversight with an executive director and an executive committee. It sort of began to give some structure to the way which policy needed to be made and assuring safety. It also called for membership, that in order to participate in the OPTN, there was a requirement for organizations to meet certain standards in order to become members, and also an advisory committee, which is perhaps not as active as they might have been in the past. So these are the things that, again, we talked about, the NOTA from 1984, the final rule in 2000, and the contract is sometimes perhaps a little bit forgotten until recently, when now we're hearing a lot about different contracts. And why do I think that's important? Well, the contract is overseen by a federal group called HRSA, Human Resources and Services Administration, and they are a part of the federal government under Health and Human Services, who are our partners in the federal government in assuring quality and safety in organ donation and transplantation. It's the HRSA contract is again to be highlighted because of, as everybody I think who has ever filled out a contract for owning a home or whatever that might be, there are rules for what the contractor can and cannot do in terms of their oversight of the organ procurement and transplant network. And as we begin as the United States learning more and more about contracts, we start to appreciate that sometimes the misperception of what has not been done in the past is really as a result of what language is contained in the contract. And so when given the opportunity to talk about if we were to design a perfect system, looking very carefully at contracts and what it said in that contract is very important. I put this slide together to try and make sense out of what is a very difficult thing to understand. You'll see at the bottom the UNOS contractor, the OPTN contractor UNOS, and you see as you rise, up that pyramid, the various levels of oversight that ultimately leads to the secretary for the Department of Health and Human Services, Secretary Becerra there on the right. Again, lots of people that are required in order for the system to function smoothly, and also for assurances that there is a focus on the organ procurement and transplant network. Why I put over to the right, importantly, is the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid. That's the payment organization within our federal system. You can see that those are different, HRSA and CMS, and sometimes getting those two groups together and organized has in the past proven to be a little bit challenging. There has been an effort to bring them more together. The Organ Transplant Affinity Group was created by CMS and HRSA to bring the groups together to spend more time collectively thinking and literally being put around the table to figure out how we can do more for donation and transplant, rather than sort of operating within silos that we often find ourselves and resulting in challenges when looking at the big picture ultimately with patients. You'll see, and I'm not going to spend time too much on this slide, but what the OTAG has tried to do is to talk about more than what you see in NOTA in the final rule, which are things of assuring access to transplant programs to people that need organs, can actually be assured that they can get and be listed for transplant, assuring that there is a patient voice involved in the discussions around organ allocation and policy development. And while that all may seem kind of obvious, the truth of the matter is that without having some structure and some expectations, we often find that we can fall short. And so the OTAG's opportunity, or the OTAG's purpose, was to try and add some structure to some of these things. One of the things that I just put this up here as a new model to try and demonstrate some combination of HRSA and CMS is new payment models that look at trying to promote organ donation and transplantation through incentives and disincentives, with which transplant programs are expected to participate in. And so I'm intentionally trying to demonstrate that there is opportunity with federal oversight and federal cooperation and government support, but it must be balanced carefully, assuring that the voice of the providers and the patients continue to be at that table, and again having as equal a measure in the construction of the future of our organ and donation transplant system. And back to the contract, again, anyone really can apply for the contract. And as we move forward with a new modernization project, we'll see that this is now becoming open to for-profit organizations. It's a 5-year contract. We're currently at an extension as we are looking at the transition contracts, which HRSA is now putting together, and some modifications may happen throughout the year. And while at times myself and others have conflated or put together both the OPTN and the United Network for Organ Sharing, they are very different. The OPTN is the network with which donation and transplant practices are developed and overseen, and UNOS is the contractor. The problem was, as you see at the bottom, was there was a concern about conflicts of interest, and recently has resulted in separations of the two boards, with UNOS no longer acting as the OPTN, and still some decisions around what the OPTN is going to look like moving forward by HRSA. And as I said, in March, the two boards officially separated, which is an effort to try and assure focus on the OPTN and not have further clarity by the board members regarding their fiduciary responsibility to the network. The board of directors is very important. The board of directors are the group that has the final decision on any policies moving forward. There are 42 voting members, including the 5 officers which make up the executive committee. There are regional representatives. We have 11 regions in the United States, and those are selected by regional committees. Importantly, patient and donors are on the board of directors. The professional societies, namely one like the American Society of Transplantation, has a position on the board. And then we have 7 additional at-large members who help sort of fill gaps in knowledge to assure that board has the knowledge and the composition for really whatever might come before it in terms of decision making for donation and transplant. And you can see again by the pie chart on the bottom, 50% MDs, 25% patient and donor affairs representatives, and other transplant professionals make up another 25%. Now, this is currently what's in the final rule. There are questions as to whether that might change as we move to different contracts. The OPTN has varying committees. You can see them on the slide. Many of them speak for themselves, but just sort of briefly wanted to speak about two, which I think are very important. The Policy Oversight Committee is one of the committees which actually helps sort of develop strategy, and recognizing we are limited by time and really volunteer work, which is how the majority of the OPTN effort is run, is through volunteers. But if we were to do everything at the same time, of course, we'd find that was a significant failure. But the Policy Oversight Committee is an effort to try and assure that we are sticking to the strategic policies, and that we are prioritizing and sometimes changing those priorities, and also evaluating once things have been implemented, whether or not they've been successful. Well, why is that important? Because if you look at just the incredible amount of time that sometimes is necessary, and Dr. Agrawal is going to talk about allocation, you can see to the left is the number of expected hours. It's almost 6,000 hours that are required for some of these, what would think to be perhaps simple changes in allocation, but from a national computerized system, certainly take a lot of technicians' time. And so we have to be thoughtful when we're deciding to add a new project. And then the Membership Professional Standards Committee is sometimes thought about that sort of that inquisition that is constantly looking to find problems. And I can promise you it's not that, but it is a committee that's charged with ensuring that the OPTN meets and stays in compliance with bylaws and policies. 38 members, and many of those, again, similar to the board, with the associate counselors representing the MPSC, with, again, a vast and diverse group that assure that every organ and every system is represented on the MPSC, to try and assure that we are helping transplant programs that are perhaps having problems. And as I mentioned, there's often a misperception that the only thing the MPSC does is sort of find problems. And the reality is that really there's an appreciation that, a lot of times support of one transplant program by another is all that's necessary, in addition to assuring that programs are remaining compliant with the expectations of the policies and the bylaws. There are certain metrics with which transplant programs must follow, and they have changed within the past couple of years to be not only post-transplant metrics, the ones on the top, which are graft survivals both at 90 days and 1 year, but now we actually have looking at the pre-transplant metrics of how transplant programs are in accepting organs that are offered to them, and also assuring that programs are keeping close watch on their wait list to watch pre-transplant mortality rates, in order to assure that we are providing the full sort of spectrum of oversight, service, and care for our patients, and not only focused on the patients that actually make it to transplant and that their organs do well. So again, what I think is important is the U.S. system is not looking to try and punish transplant programs for doing good work, but the concern is, because this is a valuable and limited resource, really the focus of attention for the MPSC are those two questions in red: is, does it pose an urgent and severe risk to patient health or public safety? And does it pose a risk to the integrity or trust in the OPTN? We are a volunteer system, and certainly if there is significant concerns about our transplant programs being good stewards of this valuable resource, could we in fact lose the trust of the public and create a void in the opportunity for transplantation? Because I think we have to recognize, without donation, there is no transplantation. There are various things that the MPSC can do, and to the right, there are certainly more severe than others. And as a past MPSC member and OPTN board and president, I can say that very few times is there a need to think about those actions on the right. And really what the purpose of the MPSC is to, if necessary, to help find focused improvement and to involve additional transplant resources and opportunities to help transplant programs that perhaps are having problems with deaths following transplant, with graft loss following transplants, with inability to accept what would be an expected standard transplantable organ by utilizing the support of their peers. And so you've heard a lot about some of the folks on this slide. What is often in the center of a lot of this is the organ procurement organizations, as I mentioned earlier in the presentations. We have 56 of those in the United States, and those are not-for-profit organizations that are the interface between donor families and transplant centers. And they have a significant responsibility. As I say, without donation, there is no transplantation. But they are, again, at the most challenging times of people's lives, offering the opportunity for donation. And they have some significant oversight as well by the Centers for Medicaid Services. And we are a bit concerned moving forward with what the future of OPOs look like, as we are have an oversight system which demands that they not only increase the numbers of donations, but they also have increase in the numbers of transplantations, which really then demands the cooperations of OPOs and transplant centers, which again is a focus of our talk moving forward. And then the final group that I want to mention is Donate Life America. In order for an appreciation of donation in the United States, Donate Life America serves as the organization which looks to register individuals interested in becoming a deceased donor at the time of their death. There now is a new program to look at living donation, but there's been lots of terrific data that has demonstrated that people who register to consider donation are more likely to donate when the time comes, when during a time of their life they're more able to think about the opportunity to give the gift of life rather than at the tragic moment when someone approaches them from the OPO. So again, I'm going to set up Dr. Agrawal. We have the policies and bylaws, which are very easily found on the internet. I always support having those readily available so that folks can find them when they're necessary. And I think to move forward, I always try and ask the question of why do we make policy? And the we is purposely chosen because in the United States, policy is primarily directed by the contributors in the system. The donation system, the transplant system, all of us that actually are doing the work and interfacing with patients are individuals that have the opportunity to make policy. And if you look on the website, what it says is that the policy is made for patients and for donors. It's actually not made for our transplant programs or for the OPOs or for anybody within the specific transplant program. It's made for patients and donors. And I think that's very important, but we have to consider that if we don't bring donors and patients together, in other words, bring OPO work and transplant center to work, policies just then become aspirational. And all the work that we do in creating all these various policies, this is just multiple ones copied and pasted, which took a long time, but it's, I think, important to recognize the tremendous amount of work that actually happens within the OPTN. But if we're unable to come together, not only as a community, but also as those pillars that I talked about before, OPOs and transplant programs, to assure that we are all sort of operating from the same sheet of music, and we're really failing those that come forward both to give the gift of life and those that need us. We look at this as a stepwise policy. This is kind of the way that it is developed and how we visualize this, that starts with an idea that can come from multiple different places. There's various steps along this policy that require further pass through by the Policy Oversight and Committee and the board. But the perhaps most important piece that I wanted to highlight is this piece called public comment, where everybody has the opportunity to contribute and to discuss policies that are moving forward. The concern is that this is somewhat of a laborious and slow process that takes about a 6-month period for us to get from idea to all the way potentially, and not all the time, but to potentially get to the board of directors for consideration and approval. And we are since looking to try and change that pattern. Now, we are constantly trying to figure out balances between utility and equity, between supply and demand. And it's not the easiest thing to do at times because the US is a big territory, lots of distance to cover. And so if you simply look at efforts to try and reduce things like non-utilization of kidneys by 5%, while at the same time achieving equity, those are sometimes at counterbalance to each other. And so it's not the easiest thing in the world to do. We do have a strategic plan, which is updated every 4 years. And the 4 goals, which are better demonstrated on this slide, the number 1 goal is always increase the numbers of transplants. You can see increase equity, increasing outcomes, and promoting safety. Where we are right now is we've spent a lot of time in the most recent years looking at equity. And certainly we would like to be able to increase the numbers of transplants, which you can see is the total expected OPTN effort is over 50%. Majority of our work is actually at those levels. The priorities of the OPTN are looking at what's called continuous distribution, which Dr. Agrawal will talk about, efficient matching, and assuring equity between multi-organ transplants and solid organ transplants. The overwhelming majority of the work at the OPTN is looking at those three policy priorities. So this is the final rule that looks at allocation. If you have trouble reading, I can get these rules to you, but they are quite thick and sometimes challenging to read. But importantly, the allocation policy says that no one should be disadvantaged based upon where they live, and we should try and distribute organs over as broad a geography as possible, which is somewhat of a challenge when you look at how we've evolved from a donor service area and regions, and now are looking to remove geography completely from allocation. It is, again, I think a laudable goal to assure that we have equity and assure that everyone has equal access to transplants. But data that we won't share today shows that our non-utilization rate has increased as well, and so we have to find a change. What I just want to leave you with is recognize that things are changing dramatically in the United States. There's been an effort in what we're going to call what's called modernization. And HRSA is looking to try and provide more resources to the OPTN to perhaps utilize the expertise in the community rather than having a single contract. There is expected to have multiple contracts with, again, opportunities for experts in the community to contribute to that. The president of last year signed the Organ Procurement and Transplant Network Act, which now allows for the contract to be split into multiple ones, including the use of private profit or for-profit organizations, as well as increase significantly the funding for the OPTN. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities. So as we look to now move to the next million, you'll see that our focus is really on and to continue to increase equity, to minimize our non-utilization rate, to utilize some of the remarkable technology, including AI, and some of the magnificent transportation and preservation opportunities that are now available to us, and really ensuring that we're empowering patients. And so I thank you for this opportunity and want to pass things off to Dr. Agrawal.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper, for such a nice illustration telling us about the Medicare program, the OPTN and MPSC, board of directors, the entire system, issues with the allocation, and many other facts. Now, we'll go ahead with the second presentation from Dr. Agrawal. And once both of them have presented, then we'll go to the discussion and question and answer session. Dr. Agrawal is another great nephrologist from US. She's basically transplant nephrologist and focuses mainly on the live donor transplant program. Her areas of interest are donor advocacy, kidney pair donation, and desensitization. With keen interest in transplant immunology, she participates in various tolerance trials associated and affiliated with Northwestern's African American Transplant Access Program, and is committed to addressing disparities in transplant access and outcomes. She has got NIH grant evaluating culturally sensitive APOL1 genetic counseling. Passionate about her education, she's a skilled nephrologist and very popular among the medical students. And right now, the Transplant Nephrology Fellowship Program Director. Over to you, Dr. Akansha, please.
Thank you, Dr. Srivastava, for that kind introduction. And we're very thankful to all those who are joining our webinar today. We at the AST are very glad to partner with the ISOT in promoting organ transplant and just moving the needle in transplantation forward. I have a keen interest in the topic being presented today. I actually did my initial training in transplant in India was a long time ago, but so my roots are there, and I have a little bit of insight into the donation system in India as it was a little over a decade ago. I don't have any disclosures relevant to this presentation. Dr. Cooper did a really fantastic job describing the evolution of organ transplantation in the US as it relates to policy, bylaw, the legal, and the administrative aspect. And just to recap, that began with Congress passing the NOTA, or the National Organ Transplant Act, in 1994, which led to formalization of the OPOs, establishment of the Organ Procurement and Transplantation Network, and the Scientific Registry for Transplant Recipients. The OPTN has been, the contract has been with UNOS since 1986. And again, like Dr. Cooper said, in many ways was synonymous with OPTN up until recently. This is overseen by HRSA, the Health Resources and Service Administration, within the Department of Health and Human Services. And this is the roadmap that we have. This is the policy and the infrastructure that we have. I'm gonna take this forward, and I'm gonna talk about, with this roadmap, what does the journey look like to transplant? What does the journey look like for a patient, for a deceased donor and their family, and for the transplant center? So I'm gonna begin with a patient who needs a transplant. I'm going to use the kidney transplant as an example throughout my talk, but really this is applicable to all organs. The journey stays very similar. So step one is getting and staying on the list, right? And so how do we get a patient who needs a transplant on the list? The first step is referral to a transplant center. Now, this seems intuitive, but actually timely referral is the key. And that's something we're really trying to promote within the United States. This is the SRTR data, the annual data report from 2022, which looks at the distribution of adults waiting for kidney transplant by years on dialysis. If you focus on the purple and the green lines here, you'll see that about 25% of people who entered or who joined the waiting list in 2022 were not on dialysis or were preemptive. And another 25% had less than 2 years of waiting time. So that's good. About half our patients are entering the waiting list with less than 2 years of waiting time. But what we'd really like to do is increase this purple line and increase the number of people who are getting referred for transplantation early. Compare this to the lines at the bottom, the blue and the orange lines. And we still have a number of people who are being referred to transplant after having been on dialysis for more than 6 years. So about somewhere around 20% of patients are entering the waiting list with more than 6 years of waiting time. Next step, once the individual's been referred to a transplant center, they then undergo a thorough pre-transplant evaluation, which is performed by a dedicated multidisciplinary team of transplant professionals. This is truly a team effort. It includes nephrologists and surgeons, our immunologists and HLA lab directors. The nurse coordinators play a key role, along with pharmacists, social workers, financial liaisons. We also partner with colleagues across multiple specialties. We need our cardiologists, radiologists, transplant psychiatrists, and we work closely with the patient's primary care doctor and their community general nephrologist or the referring nephrologist. The process includes education. This is actually mandated. We have OPTN rules for that. We describe their transplant options. They receive education about possible medical and surgical complications. We share with them the SRTR data on waitlist metrics and outcomes, and they're told about what to expect post-transplant for their post-transplant care. The evaluation includes a thorough perioperative cardiac risk assessment, age and gender-specific cancer screening, and immunologic risk assessment, which includes their HLA typing and their PRA profile, screening for infectious diseases, assessment of their comorbid illnesses, and a psychosocial assessment. Once they have completed all the required evaluation, that's when they get on the list. And UNAT is the technology used by UNOS to manage all the data and run the software. And so the transplant program, and that's usually our transplant nurse coordinators, adds all the data for that patient and all their health data to the national waiting list. And that's when we say the patient's listed and is now able to receive organ offers. But getting on the list, what's also important is staying on the list, which means staying ready for transplant at any time when an organ becomes available. And waitlist management is actually an important task that we at the transplant center do. These patients are brought back in clinic for periodic reevaluations. We update their clinical history, health status, any testing that might need to be updated. We also get serial assessments of their HLA antibody profile, and that better informs the virtual cross-match for when they do receive an offer. So they get on the list and they stay on the list. But what happens to an individual once they get on the list? So this is, again, the SRTR annual data report from 2022. The time on the x-axis, time 0, is when they enter the list. And we're looking at what is their 3-year outcome once they enter the list. So if we look at the green line here, about 25% of them have had a deceased donor transplant at 3 years. The purple line, about 25% are still on the waiting list. About 15% have had a living donor transplant. That's the pink line here. But if we look at those who were died or removed from the list, about 1/3 of patients have either died or were removed from the list 3 years after being listed. And these are the numbers, right? So in 2022, about 25,000 individuals were transplanted, but about 18,000 individuals either died or were too sick for transplant or removed from the list for other reasons. And this, again, indicates the importance of referring these patients early so that they can get on the list early and get transplanted early with the minimum amount of time spent on dialysis. All right, next step. We're changing gears. We'll talk about what this journey looks like for a donor and their family. So the potential donor's family is contacted and consented by the organ procurement organization. Once all the consents have been obtained, health data is added by the OPO coordinator to DonorNet. And that's the software that UNOS uses to manage donor information and then the subsequent match run. These are just some screenshots for what the DonorNet summary looks like for the donor. And this is what we have a chance to review when we're reviewing a potential organ offer for a recipient. So it has the demographic data about the donor. This is all de-identified. The age, sex, body mass index, their cause of death, whether it was a DCD donor or not. The donor highlights includes relevant medical history that we need to know, detailed medical and social history, including relevant comorbidities, diabetes, hypertension, coronary artery disease, smoking, infectious disease risk. This is really a very extensive data software, and we have everything available that we need to decide whether this would be an appropriate donor for our recipient. There's vital signs charting, which looks like an ICU flow sheet with vital signs being charted at regular intervals. A lot of lab information's available. We have urinalysis reports, imaging available for review, including CAT scans, x-rays, echocardiograms, HLA typings, high resolution HLA typing of the donor, as well as biopsy results, kidney biopsy, liver biopsy results for the potential donor. So once all of this information is available, the next step is, how does this donor organ actually get allocated to a particular recipient? How do we go from here to the transplant? And the key to that is generating a match run. And that means matching that unique organ to the best suited candidate. The system, DonorNet, sends automated organ offer notifications to the transplant center. The key principle of organ allocation is equitable and utilitarian distribution of these deceased donor kidneys. The factors considered are waiting time, longevity matching, the sensitization status. Dr. Cooper mentioned some geographical considerations and some special scenarios, such as individuals who've been prior living donors or those who need a transplant urgently because of lack of access for dialysis. What's really important is all of this allocation happens in a very transparent manner. I'm going to talk about a little bit of how that is achieved. The waiting time. So once the patient's on the list, they get points for how long they've been waiting. The longer they've been on dialysis or the longer they've been waiting, the more points they get, higher is their position on the list. That dialysis start date is extrapolated. We get that information from the Medicare 2728 form. Or for those who are listed preemptively, it's once they've been registered on the waiting list and their GFR drops to less than 20. Longevity matching was an important modification that was made to the allocation system by the kidney allocation system, or CAS, in 2014, with the goal of trying to achieve one kidney for life. So we want to match the individual who has the longest expected post-transplant survival with a kidney that's going to last the longest. And two scores that we use for that, one is the Kidney Donor Profile Index, which is for the donor, which expresses the relative risk of graft failure for a given donor. So the lower the KDPI score, the lower is the relative risk of graft failure, the longer the kidney is expected to survive. It ranges from 0 to 100%. And the estimated post-transplant survival is calculated for a recipient. And again, the lower the EPTS score, the longer an individual is expected to survive. And the goal is to prioritize candidates with low EPTS scores to receive kidneys with a low KDPI. And these calculators are available online. The KDPI score takes into account for the donor age, their size, the history of hypertension or diabetes, how they died, whether it was a DCD donor or a brain dead donor. And we input all this information and the software generates a KDPI score, which is then used in allocation. EPTS scores calculated for the recipient take into account the age, whether they have diabetes, and whether they're on dialysis, and whether they've received previous organ transplants. An important aspect of organ allocation is assessing immune compatibility. We want to prioritize patients who are well matched with the donor, and we look at matching at the A, B, and DR HLA loci, because again, the idea is if they're well matched with the donor, that kidney is probably going to last longer. We also want to prioritize patients who are highly sensitized and might not have access to organ offers because of that. And so a PRA score, or a calculated PRA score, is calculated based on their unacceptable antigens, and they receive prioritization points based on a sliding scale. So for example, patients with a 20% PRA get 0.08 points, which roughly approximates 1 month of waiting time. And you can see how that rises exponentially. And a patient who's highly sensitized with a PRA score of 100% receives 202 points, essentially moving them to the top of the list. Dr. Cooper alluded to geography. So the CAS 250 came into effect in 2021 to address equity in transplant access for candidates nationwide, moving away from the donor to the DSA allocation to geographical distance, using a 250 nautical mile radius around the donor hospital to be defined as local allocation. And national would be everything else, with individuals who were up to 2,500 nautical miles being able to get some additional proximity points. This is what examples of the allocation sequence. I'm not going to dwell on these. I just wanted to give you a highlight of the key points. This is how kidneys with the low KDPI scores, so the kidneys that are expected to last the longest, would be allocated because we want to allocate them to individuals with the longest survival. We prioritize patients who are local, so the kidney doesn't have to travel far, who are well matched with a 0 ABDR mismatch, and who are highly sensitized, so the 100% PRA would receive the kidney offers first, widening out to recipients located anywhere in the country. Prior living donors, we want to prioritize them, and they have access to these high quality kidneys really high up in the allocation sequence. And then we move on to patients with a 99% PRA, 98%, and then our low EPTS patients with EPTS scores of 0 to 20, and our pediatric patients, or those who are less than 18 years old. We want them to receive kidneys with the longest survival. These are allocation sequences for the slightly higher KDPI kidneys, or the standard criteria kidneys with KDPIs of 35 to 85%. Kind of follows the same track where we have the highly sensitized individuals with the 100% PRA, moving on to the 99 and the 98% PRAs, and going down the list. This is the high KDPI kidneys, or the 86 to 100% KDPI kidneys. Again, we want to prioritize individuals who are highly sensitized. They come at the top of all allocation sequences, and then moving on to individuals anywhere in the country with 100% PRA. And no longer, we will no longer see prior living donors or low EPTS individuals, because we would not like to give them a kidney with a lowered graft survival rate. This is what the match run looks like. I just wanted to put this up there. This is what we see when we have a particular offer to highlight the transparency. So I can see individuals, what sequence they are in the match run. All of this is de-identified, but we get an idea of the age of the people who are ahead of our patients, what their PRA is, how many points they have, and what their ABDR mismatch looks like. How does this look for the transplant center? How does this look for me when I'm receiving an offer? So once I get a notification from the donor OPO that there is a potential offer for one of my recipients, we review the donor and the recipient data. So that's reviewed by the transplant nurse coordinator, a nephrologist, and a surgeon. A virtual cross-match is performed by our HLA lab to ensure immune compatibility. We contact the recipient, we make sure that they're healthy, we share the offer details, we see if they're interested in that offer. If yes, the organ is accepted, the donor OPO is informed, the organ's transported to the recipient center, and the recipient comes in and they get their transplant. But the journey doesn't stop there. What's really important, and Dr. Cooper alluded to this, was what happens post-transplant. We need to collect data, and we need to monitor the quality of our transplants. And so data is collected for donor, for candidates, as well as for recipient specific, the center records. And this creates a robust understanding of the organ donation and transplantation. The data is collected by OPTN via the Transplant Information Electronic Data Interchange software, as well as some other sources that CMS and Social Security information. And all of this data is received, managed, and analyzed by the SRTR, or the Scientific Registry for Transplant Recipients, which provides advanced statistical and epidemiological analysis related to organ allocation and transplant, and we get an annual data report. It's like a report card that tells us how we're doing for our patients. So that was our journey. I think we've come a really long way. This is data from 2023, annual data. We performed over 46,000 transplants, over 23,000 donors, both deceased as well as living. And this was, it was a 13th consecutive record-breaking year. We had more than 16,000 deceased donors in 2023, but we still have a long way to go. This was the OPTN strategic plan. Dr. Cooper mentioned our goal is increase the number of transplants, improve equity and access to transplants, improve outcomes for waitlisted patients, for living donors and transplant recipients, and also focus on safety of living donors as well as transplant recipients. I'm gonna stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
So that was a very nice presentation by Dr. Akansha, Dr. Cooper. There is a lot to learn and exchange between the ISOT and AST. Just to give you a brief scenario of Indian transplant. So in 2013, India was doing around 4,000 transplants. And in 10 years, now that number has increased 4 times. Mostly in India, 80 to 85% of transplants are living donor. Around 15% to 20% are disease donor. In last year, that was 2023, total disease donor transplants were 2,904. And the number of disease donor which were identified in 2013, it was around 340, while in 2023, the number has increased to 1037. Though there is a remarkable jump, but there is a gap which we need to address because the demand is more as compared to the identification of disease donors. In India, the disease donation is more or less restricted to the south and western part of India. North is picking up, and Northeast is also trying to increase its disease donation rate. Government is proactively supporting the diseased organ donation. The allocation is through NATO, that is the National Organ Transplant Tissue Organization. This is the umbrella body, NATO, for organ allocation. In NATO, we have the regional 5 ROTOs, that is the regional organization. And in each ROTO, we have few state organizations. In India, health is a state subject. So the policy may differ from state to state. But overall, the NATO controls, gives the guidelines, and in a way handles the allocation and transplantation program. As you just told us about the KDPI and other allocation principles, similarly in India, NATO has issued some guidelines regarding the allocation, super urgent list for kidney, for liver, and even for heart and lungs. So with increase in manpower and infrastructure, the number of transplants apart from kidney and liver in heart and lungs, also India is showing the remarkable growth. So still there is a gap. We need to address that. We need to increase the diseased organ donation. We heard Dr. Akansha, Dr. Cooper, and the best practices which we can definitely exchange among ourselves. So thank you, Dr. Akansha, Dr. Cooper. So there are no open questions in the panel right now. So
Dr. Balwani, there was one of the panelists, actually our most recent past president for the AST, Dr. Kumar, asked a question about how OPOs are regulated. And if I could, I'd love the chance to answer it, although it's not a simple answer. That's kind of the obvious question and the uneasy answer. So I would say that as the diagram, the complex diagram that both Dr. Agrawal and ourselves have shown, there's lots of players in the transplant space. Officially, OPOs are regulated by the Centers for Medicare served by CMS. And through the Federal Register, there are conditions of participation with which OPOs must follow. Most currently, the metrics with which OPOs are being evaluated is based upon their donation rate and transplantation rate. And of course, those are both important. Our OPO colleagues, and I'm actually right now at the national AOPO meeting, the Association of Organ Procurement Organizations, would say that it's challenging for them to control transplantation, because obviously, practitioners like Dr. Agrawal and myself have the opportunity to accept or to decline an organ. OPOs and transplant programs work collaboratively to do our best to assure conditions are optimized so that the choice would most likely be yes. But the other piece of the oversight is that the OPTN also has oversight for OPOs. There are bylaws and policies with which OPOs must follow also. And so there is a little bit of a sort of a dualish master that OPOs must follow, and some of the policies and expectations are not perfectly aligned between the two. And that's where, again, if I was to have one wish, I've been asked this before, if you had one wish to fix things, first off, I would say it's not going to be one thing, but that sort of wish would be that we would all get together and recognize we all want the same thing: increase the numbers of transplants, provide better access, ensure safety, and again, serve the community better. And the only way that we're going to do that is if we all come together and say, collaboratively, collectively, in the United States, what do we all need to do? Give something, maybe perhaps to get something, assure that we aren't over-regulating and prohibiting people from donating and transplant. So I think it's a longer answer than probably Dr. Kumar wished, but I think it brought out an important piece that we have opportunities certainly to improve in the United States as well. So if we were to design a new system, we would probably do things differently. And so I think there's great opportunity for AST and for ISOT to continue these conversations and how we can collaborate and help one another in promoting donation and transplantation.
That was great. I can see another question in the panel that they want to ask, what is the key hurdle for increasing the DDOT program in India? So in a way, there are many challenges which we need to address. The most important thing is there is less brainstem death identification and certification at the hospital level. And also there is a gap in registry, especially the data regarding the reporting, especially the outcome of transplant. So we need to improvise upon that. Though we are improving upon the infrastructure in the private hospitals, in government, we need to capitalize and increase the pace, and we need to establish a sustainable program. And at the public level, still we think there is a lack of awareness, and we are still short of available trained transplant coordinators. And definitely the cost involved in transplantation, so it may not be within the reach of common people. So public hospitals are increasing their participation, and there are many challenges, and we need to address those. Yeah. So I think as time is running short, so I will turn it back to Brian.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
AST would like to thank the Indian Society of Organ Transplant, today's ISOT and AST panelists, and all of our attendees for today's session. Please look for an email in Zoom in about 1 week, directing you to a copy of the recording available free and on demand. Finally, please remember to complete the evaluation survey in Zoom to help us keep our content current and engaging. Thank you all again for today's excellent session.
Thanks, everyone.
So, yeah.